The international summit in Geneva was not designed for disruption. Every name on the schedule had been rehearsed, approved, and polished. Presidents, diplomats, and CEOs flew in on private jets, wore climate-conscious lapel pins, and posed beside charity banners with polite grins. The agenda was simple: talk about Africa. Again, for decades, these summits had followed the same formula: discuss Africa's problems, propose foreign-led solutions, pledge millions, sign papers, applaud, leave. But this year, the script cracked. Sitting quietly in the fifth seat of the Global South panel was Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. Young, unflinching, and known for his raw defiance of global systems, Traoré was not supposed to be there. His name had been debated. Some said he was too radical. Others feared he'd embarrass the West. But after a last-minute shift in the lineup, thanks to African Union pressure, his invitation arrived. The media took notice. "He's too blunt," whispered one commentator. "He won't stick to protocol," muttered another. Traoré didn't care. He flew commercial, wore his military fatigues, declined the VIP hotel, and when asked for a statement before the panel, he simply said, "I will listen first." Beside him on the panel sat U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, graceful and composed, representing the might and diplomacy of America. She'd already spoken twice during the summit, once on democratic resilience, once on global equity. Her speeches were met with nods and smiles. Her presence, calm and familiar, was welcomed. The session began. Like any other, the moderator, a retired UN economist, offered a warm welcome and asked the opening question: "What does Africa need most from the world right now?" Kamala Harris leaned forward, poised to speak again. But before she could, Traoré's voice cut gently across the room. He wasn't loud, but everyone heard him. "If Africa is so poor, why are you still here?" The silence that followed was not ordinary. It was historical. The cameras froze, zooming in on Kamala Harris's face. She didn't flinch, but her expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough. Her lips tightened. Her hand moved from the desk to her lap. She didn't expect it. No one did. Traoré didn't elaborate. He didn't smile. He simply looked ahead, unmoved, as if he had not just shaken the summit from its foundations. The moderator stuttered. Other panelists looked down. Kamala took a breath, her diplomatic instincts kicking in. She offered a composed response, touching on trade, security, and partnership, but the moment had already taken root. Something had cracked open, and no carefully layered language could patch it. Traoré had said what millions across Africa had long whispered behind closed doors, beneath the weight of aid, contracts, and foreign missions. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a complaint. It was a mirror. Why does a continent so broken attract so many investors? Why do foreign powers build military bases in a place they call unstable? Why are its resources taken, then sold back at 10 times the price? The sentence wasn't about offense. It was about exposure. And Kamala Harris, brilliant and seasoned, as she was, had nothing prepared for it. The room shifted. Applause didn't come, but attention sharpened. From Nairobi to Johannesburg, Dakar to Addis Ababa, people watched clips of the exchange over and over again, not to mock Harris, but to remember what Traoré had dared to ask. In Accra, murals appeared overnight with the quote. In Lagos, radio hosts replayed it every hour. In Soweto, schoolchildren recited it as poetry, and in Washington, press teams scrambled to soften the fallout. The next morning, global headlines swirled. Burkina Faso's president stuns Kamala. Harris with just one sentence. Traoré's question goes viral across Africa. Aid or control? A summit shaken by one remark. But Traoré didn't speak to the press. He visited a Geneva refugee center, shook hands with African workers in exile, then flew home quietly. No entourage, no celebration. At home in Ouagadougou, he returned to his daily routine. No public statement, no interviews, He met with farmers, reviewed energy infrastructure, approved budget reforms. When his military advisor asked why he didn't defend the remark on record, Traoré replied, "If they felt something, then they already understand." But Kamala Harris did respond. She gave a speech the following week at an African-American university in Atlanta. Her tone was respectful. She acknowledged colonial scars. She promised new investments in African innovation, not extraction. She never named Traoré. But the room understood. The internet understood. Because for the first time in years, Africa wasn't just mentioned. It had spoken, and the world was still echoing. The summit ended, but the sentence refused to die. In the days that followed, Traoré's simple remark became more than a viral clip. It became a mirror across continents. Across think tanks in London, foreign ministries in Brussels, and corporate offices in New York, uncomfortable conversations began. If Africa is so poor, why are you still here? No one could ignore it. No one could erase it. It was just 11 words. But it was enough to unravel years of packaged diplomacy and carefully curated aid optics. For the first time in recent memory, the Western world was being asked not what it could give Africa, but why it kept taking without admitting it. Into a TV studios, panels debated the ethics of resource extraction masked as development. In African universities, professors rewrote syllabi overnight to include Traoré's statement in the study of modern Pan-Africanism. And on the streets, young people painted murals, not of flags, but of eyes opening. Kamala Harris, though silent, for days understood what had happened. Her team prepared multiple response drafts, but none of them fit. She wasn't angry. She wasn't humiliated. She was awakened because deep down she recognized what had made the moment so powerful. It wasn't an attack. It was a question, and it had no clean answer. Meanwhile, back in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré did what few expected. He disappeared from the spotlight entirely. He retreated to the eastern provinces, where drought and insurgency had turned villages into ghost towns. For 10 days, there were no press releases, no public appearances. Only grainy photos of him walking through broken roads with local elders, sleeping in unfinished clinics, and helping distribute solar-powered lamps to nomadic children. His government didn't spin it. They didn't live stream it. Because it wasn't for the cameras. It was for continuity. To the people of Burkina Faso, Traoré's Geneva remark wasn't brave. It was overdue. But his silence afterward, that was the real message. We've said what needed to be said. Now we build what must be built. Back in the West, however, the story had a different arc. Several mainstream outlets tried to reframe the exchange. Was Traoré disrespectful? Or daring? The new voice of African populism? Should leaders like Kamala Harris engage or walk away? But online, people weren't interested in debates. They were inspired. Across the Caribbean, the African diaspora held vigils and truth nights, where poets and thinkers reflected on identity, extraction, and dignity. In Paris, African immigrants projected the quote onto colonial-era statues. In Boston, a group of students staged a silent protest outside a museum that still displayed looted African artifacts. And in South Africa, a 19-year-old named Zanele started a digital movement called You're Still Here, inviting youth from across the continent to share what they had lost to foreign intervention and what they still protected. Within a week, it had 2 million posts. The silence Traoré left behind had become a language, and the youth understood it better than any foreign-funded syllabus ever could. But not everyone celebrated. In a closed-door G7 meeting, diplomats from several powerful countries called Traoré unpredictable. Sanctions were quietly discussed. Future summits considered tighter speaker vetting, and think tanks warned of rising anti-Western rhetoric in African governance. None of this reached the public, but in Ouagadougou, Traoré's Security Council intercepted a private communiqué that confirmed what he already suspected. His country's shift toward sovereignty wasn't just inconvenient anymore, it was threatening. They weren't upset because he criticized them. They were unsettled because he said it without anger. He said it calmly, he said it honestly. And worse, he didn't ask for anything. He didn't beg for recognition. He didn't demand apology. He didn't even stay for applause. He just asked the question and left. That was the most dangerous part. On the 14th day after the summit, Kamala Harris made an unannounced visit to Howard University, where she once studied. It wasn't in her official schedule, but a quiet gathering of African American students had requested her presence at a private dialogue on the future of Africa and the diaspora. She arrived without press. They asked hard questions. She gave thoughtful answers. But at the end, one student, a girl wearing a Burkina Faso bracelet, stood up and asked, "Madam Vice President, what did you think of Traoré's question?" The room stilled. Kamala looked at her for a moment, then said, "It reminded me that the world we inherited is full of truths we've never fully faced. And it reminded me that listening is part of leadership too." No applause, just quiet respect. And as she left that evening, a student snapped a photo of her walking alone, holding a printed copy of Traoré's quote. It went viral because something had shifted, not just in Africa, but in the soul of the system itself. The Geneva summit faded from the headlines, replaced by new controversies, new elections, new promises. But the question stayed. It didn't trend anymore. It evolved. It etched itself into textbooks, into street murals, into the language of African children who now stood taller in classrooms. If Africa is so poor, why are you still here? At first it had been seen as a provocation, then a reckoning. Now it was becoming a principle, a quiet declaration of self-respect. Ibrahim Traoré had returned to governing with urgency and purpose. His administration shifted focus entirely inward, rebuilding roads with local materials, launching Pan-African STEM schools, banning foreign NGOs that operated without full transparency, and reinvesting every ounce of gold profit into food sovereignty projects. He stopped accepting foreign grants tied to political conditions. Western analysts warned of economic suicide. But within a year, Burkina Faso's inflation stabilized. Youth unemployment dropped, and maternal mortality fell to its lowest in history. He wasn't building a perfect nation. He was building a free one. And yet Traoré never again addressed the Geneva moment publicly. When asked in interviews, he deflected. That was then, he would say. Let's talk about irrigation, healthcare, teachers. But behind closed doors, he knew exactly what had happened. He had cracked the narrative. Across the continent, other leaders took notice. Some mocked him quietly. Others feared being compared to him. But a handful began to walk beside him. Senegal removed 40% of foreign military presence. Ghana passed a law requiring all foreign resource contracts to undergo public citizen review. Kenya launched a Think African initiative, requiring all development projects to include indigenous planning councils. The Traoré effect, as scholars began to call it, was not about one sentence. It was about one shift, from asking for help to asking the right questions, from being managed to being respected, from silence to structure. In Washington, D.C., Kamala Harris carried the moment with quiet reflection. She never responded to it again, not in speeches, not in interviews. But those who worked closest to her noticed a change. She requested deeper briefings on Africa, not just economic updates, but cultural frameworks, colonial histories, and youth activism. She made personal time to meet with African students. She pushed back on funding structures that prioritized influence over impact. It wasn't guilt, it was growth, because even silence can teach, if you're listening. A year later, a private invitation was sent from the African Union to Kamala Harris, not to speak, not to lead, to attend a closed roundtable in Dakar with rising African youth leaders, including Zanele, the founder of I Are Still Here, and 4 others from rural villages turned innovators. Kamala accepted. She arrived quietly, with no press, no entourage, just a notebook and the willingness to listen. The event was held under an open tent. Wind rustled the fabric. Drums echoed from a nearby school. The youth took turns sharing ideas. Some were bold, some naive, some brilliant. Kamala took notes, asked questions. Then, without warning, Zanele handed her a card. On one side it said, "If Africa is so poor, why are you still here?" On the other side, in handwriting, "Now that we're building it ourselves, will you stay when we say no?" Kamala held the card for a long time. Then she smiled, and in the only speech she gave that week to a group of high school girls, she said, "True partnership begins where power ends. If I have learned anything, it's that sometimes the best way to lead is to let others lead too." Back in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré walked through a village market without security. Children ran up to him, not out of fear, not even out of fame, but out of familiarity. They called him Tonton Ibrahim. He bought oranges, gave advice, checked on solar lamp repairs. Then someone handed him a book, a collection of African quotes compiled by university students. He flipped through it. On the last page, in bold ink, was a single sentence framed like scripture. "If Africa is so poor, why are you still here?" Ibrahim Traoré, he chuckled, then closed the book and kept walking, because lions don't roar to be heard forever. Sometimes, once the forest wakes up, they simply disappear into it, proud, quiet, and undefeated. It began as a sentence, but by the time the second year rolled in, it had become a curriculum. Across African universities, the phrase, "If Africa is so poor, why are you still here?" wasn't just quoted. It was dissected, taught, analyzed. It became the first line in essays and the final question in debates. It sparked think tanks from Kigali to Accra. But then something no one expected happened. The West began listening, not defensively, not diplomatically, but curiously. For the first time in decades, institutions that once framed Africa through spreadsheets and security reports began sending their youngest minds, not to observe or advise, but to learn. Harvard launched a cross-partner program on post-extraction African economies, fully co-authored by African economists. Oxford opened a fellowship exclusively for African historians to teach pre-colonial governance models. Even the IMF quietly shifted language in its internal documentation. Assistance was replaced with partnership, stability with sovereignty. These were subtle, bureaucratic moves. But they meant something, because when language changes, systems are forced to follow. In Washington, Kamala Harris had completed her second term as vice president. She wasn't running again. Her public life had slowed, but her influence remained strong. On a crisp fall morning, she received a call from a new African-American senator from Illinois. A former community organizer turned politician. He had just returned from a youth summit in Nairobi and wanted her to speak at a U.S.-Africa Relations town hall. She hesitated. It had been years since Geneva, years since Traoré's question silenced the room, but the echo still lived in her. She agreed. The event was held in Detroit. The hall was packed. African-American youth, diplomats, entrepreneurs, and educators filled every seat. There were no handshakes, no flags, just raw space for truth. When Kamala took the stage, she spoke slowly without notes. There was a day in Geneva when a leader didn't make a speech. He asked a question. I didn't answer that day. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't supposed to. Some questions aren't for rebuttal, they're for reflection. The audience stayed quiet, hanging on her words. What Traoré asked wasn't just about aid. It was about accountability, about recognizing that the power we wielded for decades came with a silence we never questioned. But I heard him. I still do. And then, looking directly into the crowd, she added, "The real question is, are we still there for control? Or are we finally here to listen?" It was the most shared clip of her post office life. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré remained where he had always been, on the ground. He had declined offers to lead continental coalitions, turned down awards from global NGOs, and rejected international documentary requests. He wasn't interested in becoming an icon. He was building institutions. But something unusual arrived one day in his office. a handwritten letter from Kamala Harris. It was not political. It was personal. She thanked him, not for Geneva, but for what had followed. She shared what she had, learned what had shifted in her own understanding, and how that single sentence had taught her more than decades of briefings. She ended the letter with one line. "Thank you for saying the thing no one else would say." Traoré read it, folded it quietly, and placed it in a small drawer beside letters from his mother, a village teacher, and a child who once gifted him a toy lion carved from clay. He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because what mattered wasn't the conversation between two leaders. It was the conversation between two continents. 6 months later, the African Union launched a new annual summit called the Sovereignty Forum, a gathering of thinkers, farmers, builders, and presidents, no longer centered on outside perspectives, but on African vision. Ibrahim Traoré did not attend the first one. He sent a representative, but on the closing day, a pre-recorded video played on a large open-air screen. In it, Traoré sat beneath a baobab tree in a cotton field. He said, "Africa does not need a throne to rise. It needs roots. And roots are not built by applause. They are grown in silence beneath the surface until one day, the forest itself begins to speak." Then he paused, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. "So let the world watch. Let them wonder why we grow quietly. Because next time they ask what Africa needs, we'll reply, we needed to stop asking." The crowd in Dakar rose to its feet, not in thunder, but in stillness, because that day the forest did speak, and the echo was no longer Traoré's alone.